Now I call upon Professor Sunil Kilani to deliver his 10th anniversary distinguished public lecture.
Thank you so much, Raj, for this opportunity to be able to speak on this celebratory occasion. I'm going to take what you said earlier on this afternoon, which is that sometimes some things bear repeating, particularly when it comes to principles, and that's really going to be what I'll do in this talk. It's a tradition of speeches on celebratory occasions to start with why everyone is okay, doing great, perfectly fine, before then getting down to the brass tacks of how the world is on fire. Far be it from me to defy such esteemed tradition. And so let me begin with the good news. Universities around the world today find themselves riding strong and high. In many parts of the world, university enrollment is burgeoning on the back of large youthful populations. And meanwhile, new universities are being established at record rates. 12,000 have sprung up in China in the last 20 years. And as Professor Chauhan mentioned here, we have about approaching 1,000 universities, up from 20 or so at the time of independence. State and private funding is also on the rise, driven by a general recognition that in a post-industrial world, knowledge and research are prime movers of progress. Jindal Global University, celebrating its 10th anniversary, and the splendid achievements accompanying it, is decidedly part of that good news story. Jindal's own story has been extraordinary, and at the center of the story stands the Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Raj Kumar, a dynamo who seems to be everywhere at once. Indeed, I often wonder if he's taken the help of advanced science, combining cloning and 3D printing to create multiple versions of himself. But actually, Raj has done something much more difficult. He's successfully inculcated his infectious energy, enthusiasm, and vision across the institution so that its members really are working together to build a world-class research and teaching university, open in outlook and reflective of India's diversity. So my warmest congratulations on this fast, strong start in establishing what I expect will become an enduring and exemplary pillar of India's higher education sector. Still, when we consider that wider sector, a dark shadow should rightly cross over us when we speak of optimism and expansionism, of money and a will to institution building. It's a shadow that grows and deepens when elements that are central to the very idea of a university appear to be in jeopardy. Today, I'm going to ask you to step with me into the future to consider some of the cumulative future implications of certain events occurring today, events that in the rush of ever-diminishing news cycles get passed over as unimportant. I'd like just for a change and a start to hold two such events up to the light, both of them occurring here in Delhi this very month, and consider what they might reveal about where we might be heading. Incident one was so clumsy that it seemed at first only comic, when a cabinet minister with an economics background attempted to defend India's poor economic growth by sweeping aside the small demands of mathematical logic entirely. After all, he said, without a neutrino of self-doubt, maths never helped Einstein discover gravity. We can imagine the mathematician who actually discovered gravity, Isaac Newton, having a heavenly chuckle. A graver incident of that same week was not just an offense to scientific history and logic. It was an attack on a 45-year-old professor of English at Delhi University, a recognized scholar in his field of linguistics. Police entered his home without a search warrant, removing computing equipment, phones, books, all in a bid to incriminate him in connection with the Dalit protest case. When the local teachers' union came out in defense of the principles of academic freedom, a rival union declared that the university's English department was, quote, becoming a center of such anti-national activities, anti-India ideas, it went on to declare, must not be propagated and promoted in the name of freedom of expression. What both incidents, one facile, one significant and actually menacing, have in common is that they exemplify the anti-intellectualism rooted in a strain of opportunist nationalism that lately litters our public life. Bit by bit, incident by incident, we're seeing fissures in foundational values integral to the definition of the university itself. What are those foundational values? I'll start with three. First, the ability to engage in free and critical inquiry, to develop capacities of reason and imagination, and to exercise them in pursuit of truth, as Newton did in working out gravity. Second, equally integral is the idea, or at least the ideal, that universities, in their commitment to reason, truth, and discovery, should not be bound by the conformities of cultural habit or the strictures of transient political ideologies. Value three, what distinguishes the university among social institutions is its commitment to the belief that although the exercise of free expression may be discomforting or inconvenient in the short term, it will in general and in the long run prove beneficial. That notion that unfettered thought and expression will ultimately help to bring into being a better, smarter, and more just society, in part explains why democracies value free speech. And uniquely among the institutions of a democratic society, the university's very purpose is towards vindicating this belief. And that's why, and this is one of my themes today, the future of India's democracy is tied to what happens in our universities. Those foundational values of critical inquiry, those foundational values of critical inquiry in pursuit of truth, of free movement of ideas, and of free expression of such ideas are in fact under attack across the globe, from governments and popular movements, from the right and from the left. All over the world, governments are invoking nationalist policies to constrain scholars and control academic institutions, expelling those considered foreign and controlling the nationality of researchers in labs and seminar rooms. All over the world, governments are interfering directly in faculty appointments, in academic research, and in the teaching curricula, and in what scholars are free to study and discuss as they try to subordinate universities to their ideologies. All over the world, East and West, politicians and the public mock the expertise of academics and dismiss the values of truth and objectivity. And all over the world, most significantly, free expression is devalued and all too often shut down in universities, as nationalism, nativism, and religious cant become the litmus test of intellectual work. The result? Institutions of higher education, individual academics, and intellectuals are seriously under threat today, whether in Russia or Turkey, Nigeria or Hungary, the UK or Brazil, the US or China. The specific menace of these threats varies from country to country, depending on local cultures of democracy and free speech, on funding structures, and on the social tolerance for violence. But what we are seeing is a clear, distinct, and frightening, I think, global pattern. My goal this evening is to exhort those of us who live and work within Indian universities, and indeed all those who care about our universities and who wish them a successful future, to take seriously this upsurge of anti-intellectualism in our country. It's an upsurge at once absurd, aggressive, and deeply self-sabotaging. The big buzzword in smart circles today is AI, shorthand, of course, for the brave new world of artificial intelligence. But the AI I'd like you to consider this afternoon is anti-intellectualism. The consequences of this form of AI will be strangling instead of enhancing and releasing the vigor and creativity of the nation. The fortunate news, though, is that there's nothing predetermined or necessary about this form of AI. It can and should be refuted if we believe at all in the value of ideas and if we can find the determination to resist. What makes for good universities anyway? Well, you've had several days of deliberation about that, and all of you will know much more about that. Funding and good administration are necessary conditions for success. So too is autonomy and governance. But those are not sufficient. A successful university will depend on the capacity of its academic faculty for intellectual creativity and quality, which cannot be controlled or produced to order, and crucially, whose value cannot be predicted in advance. Absolutely essential to cultivating that capacity is academic freedom. At such a moment, it's worth revisiting the standard definition of academic freedom in relation to the modern university, one that's found in a 1915 document of the American Association of University Professors, the, as it's called, Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure. The vision of this document sees the university as an inviolable refuge, that's a quote, from the tyranny of the conformities of public opinion. It's a statement of principles informed by a very different spirit, I think, than the one permeating our public life today. There's no such parallel document in India. True, academic freedom here is endorsed as a good in virtually all the major government policy reports, from Radhakrishnan just after independence to Kothari in the late 60s to Yashpal in 2009. Yet instead of the careful articulation to be found in the century-old American document, or in later variant statements such as the 1974 Yale University report on freedom of expression, what we have in our case is an assumed good, one asserted but not robustly argued for or defended. As one scholar has put it, quote, the term academic freedom has no simple definition, but like many other such concepts, we can recognize it by its absence. Indeed, only in recent years, when academic freedom has become the target of attack, has its value received more sustained and serious attention. And let me just quickly draw out some of the recognized, well-known strands of that idea. First of all, the freedom to research and to teach, in particular to determine curriculum according to criteria and standards set by peers. Secondly, freedom of expression within the university. And thirdly, freedom for scholars to express public views on their area of expertise, and as citizens to engage in political speech and activity outside the university. Now, the principle of expression within the university, when exercised in practice, may often be contested. I fully recognize that. Certain forms of expression are legitimately excluded, such as hate speech and the incitement to violence. The crucial issue, though, is who has the authority to decide when restrictions apply. The important point is that governments must not have a say in how these contents are decided within the academic life of the university, or in how exclusions are determined. These are matters for the university as a whole, students, faculty, leadership, to figure out through reasoned debate, and even sometimes through peaceful protest. Freedom of expression within the academy needs to be secured for all the usual reasons: respect for the inherent worth of humanist values, as well as for the resulting goods free expression delivers, including often unintended benefits that follow from free expression and criticism. But I'd like now to hold up for you a series of, if you like, 6 different frames, popular frames, but distorting ones, through which academic activity has come to be viewed, and which together, I think, crimp and constrain the practice of academic freedom of expression and ultimately weaken commitment to its value. So this false frame number 1, I would call the frame of uselessness. There's an old argument reprised today that ideas and scholarship must be socially relevant, politically useful, practically expedient, ideally beneficial to, or not contrary to, some idea of the national interest. There's no better refutation of such intellectual myopia than an argument made 80 years ago by Abraham Flexner, a hard-headed academic administrator who knew a thing or two about how to create intellectual institutions of the highest quality. He founded the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, where Einstein did, I can assure you, use maths to make his various discoveries. In a 1939 essay, Flexner showed how in the sciences, in medicine, as well as in the arts, research once considered purely theoretical and useless, indulgent projects of self-absorbed scientists or scholarly arcana, in time yielded inventions such as the wireless radio, new modes of artistic perception, and the science of bacteriology. Another argument abroad today, let's call it false frame number 2, is that freedom of expression is a luxury value, not relevant to the disprivileged, who would rather just get on with it and get their practical professional training. To the contrary, allowing free expression within the university can create conditions that encourage social mobility, that challenge the hegemony of elites, and improve the chances of the less privileged. First-generation students from disprivileged backgrounds often come to university having had little space to think freely, let alone to experiment with ideas and ways of life. The free air of the university affords them opportunities to transform their lived experience in inventive ways, to find the confidence to argue, critique, and oppose, thus infusing new critical energies into the life of universities. The freedom afforded by the campus also brings into being new communities, less beholden to the hierarchies and stratifications of the wider society. As the Hindi scholar and literary critic Apurvanand has recently written, and I quote, "Universities are shelters, safe homes for social and cultural refugees. They create and nurture new proximities. If this is not nation-making, then what is?" If India's universities simply renounce or play down the principle of academic freedom, becoming environments where free thought and expression are subject to self-censorship, in the belief that they should only impart instrumental instruction, this will deny freedom, in fact, to the most disprivileged and brightest youth in the country, a double deprivation. False frame number 3, that diminishing academic freedom will have no impact on what many elites in our country do really value, India's emergence as a powerful technocratic state. In fact, efforts to constrict or devalue intellectual freedom will damage many such goals that we ought to value and put us in a position, ludicrous in any light, that we can have the products of technology without believing in the principles of science. Modern-day adepts of religious nationalism believe it is possible to harness the benefits of technology while sidestepping the basic truths of science, substituting them with religious or superstitious ideas, or with outright anti-intellectualism. In this view, science and scientific achievement becomes a way to embellish nationalism, not a contribution to human knowledge. As historian Mukul Keshavan, writing about the commandeering of India's lunar attempt to serve nationalist purposes, recently put it, this attitude, quote, is the opposite of the scientific temper. Its science is a kind of arti, where the goddess honored is Bharat Mata. Intellectual expertise is useful as a way of staging spectacle, but useless if not. And so we return to our AI, anti-intellectualism, a regnant perspective that can profess to celebrate the genuine achievements of Indian scientists while simultaneously propagating fantastical ideas in the wider culture about supposed scientific achievements during the glory days of ancient India. Such willful scrambling of the logic that leads from scientific principles to results serves to devalue science and the principles of logic, evidence, and reason. It ultimately diminishes the scientific capital built up over the past 75 years. And with this august audience, I don't think I need to belabor the point that India's current scientific and technological abilities are the fruit of heavy investments and choices made during the 1940s, 50s, 60s in the Nehru era in pure science, in nuclear energy, in space, in medicine, among other fields. And one of the strange and troubling results of what we might call our new Indian science fiction is that it leaves us trapped as mere consumers of technology, and not producers of scientific knowledge. So we have the irony of millions happily using their smart devices and iPhones, apps and chat groups to spread the oddest notions about ancient Indian science, happy to play with the results, but oblivious of what went into achieving them. Now, India is not the first society to have had such topsy-turvy values. Yet it's worth remembering what happened to others that embraced similar ideas, propagating fantasies about religious perfection or racial supremacy in order to avoid scientific truths. Recall, for instance, how in 1930s Germany, racist ideology was fervently adopted by engineers and technicians. Now recall how pilots and technically trained professionals formed Al-Qaeda's frontline. Historians have characterized this phenomenon as reactionary modernism, a cultural form parasitic on the knowledge produced by science, but unable to generate any cognitive value of its own. The adepts of such views, although they haven't yet achieved such sway here, have their precursors in, for instance, the advocates of proletarian science or Lysenkoism in 1930s Soviet Union, or creationists today, and there are many other examples one can think of. When such ideas enter into the public discourse and flourish, the currency of truth and fact are devalued. When our leaders and their followers make truth and fact discretionary and subordinate to ideological preferences by making it seem we can pick and choose our facts, they create a hostile environment for academic and intellectual freedom. And if universities are to adhere to their responsibility to produce knowledge, they can't simply hide from this political conflict. They need to challenge and refute untruth and false claims to knowledge. Otherwise, the dissemination of such ideas will corrode the very conditions of possibility that enable universities to do the work they're supposed to do. That is, the pursuit of knowledge, tested constantly by standards of logic, evidence, and reason. For our universities to imagine that they can stay neutral in such debates is, I'd suggest, a mistake, even from the viewpoint of their own self-interest. False frame number 3, that academic inquiry should conform to the social and political exigencies, the ideology of the day. The relationship between universities and the state and society is never one of simple alignment of interests. Perhaps it is best characterized, in the words of the Cambridge literary historian and critic Stefan Collini, as a Faustian pact. As he puts it, societies, quote, ask universities to serve various practical purposes. But if they are to be given the intellectual freedom necessary to serve those purposes properly, they will always tend to exceed or subvert those purposes. Over the span of history, universities have been established at different times with different purposes: to educate the clergy for the church, train bureaucrats for the state, or buff up professionals for corporations. In order to fulfill their goals, universities needed freedom to educate as best they saw fit. And such freedom could then allow those within universities to reflect on, criticize, and even subvert and revise the underlying purposes that motivated the initial establishment of these institutions. Recall some historical examples. Colleges once found to impart religious education, like Trinity College or King's College in Cambridge, went on to generate the rational thinking that led to the scientific revolutions, undermining superstition and instigating the crisis of religious belief. An example closer to home, the British established universities in India, hoping to produce docile servitors of the colonial state. Yet they also helped to educate Indian nationalists who contested and ultimately brought down the British Empire. In another instance, closer in time, the expansion of American universities during the Cold War was aimed at enhancing the power of the US state and military power. But it provoked the emergence of the counterculture of the 1960s that pioneered critiques of the state, authority, patriarchy, and technology in the service of the state, and seeded the ground for Silicon Valley's reimagining of technology. So while universities are in some sense beholden to the politics and culture of their societies and paymasters, they have also come to be recognized as having a special status, enjoying privileges rooted in their knowledge-creating and educational role that other bureaucratic institutions or corporate organizations do not have. And the most fundamental such privilege is an intellectual one. It's the freedom to ask second-order questions. Take the example of nationalism. The function of the university is not to ask, how can we make better nationalists? Rather, it is to pose meta-questions such as, what is nationalism? How does it vary across time and place? Why does it become important at particular moments in the life of a society? What positive values does it embody? What are its blind spots and limits? The better a university is at pursuing such questions, the more it will serve to place in perspective, in some sense defamiliarize and render open to analysis, things we might otherwise accept unthinkingly. False frame number 4. Global recognition of intellectual quality and ranking and the imperatives of a narrow national identity can be pursued simultaneously. The Indian academic and intellectual world is today placed in a peculiar double bind. On the one hand, there's a desire for recognition in the international scholarly community for their approval and imprimatur, and hence the focus on world university rankings. In the most recent one, though it seems Indian institutions seem to have slipped further, and one of the reasons seems to be the poor showing of the limitations of the international outlook of Indian institutions. And that's perhaps not surprising, given that it's become all too common practice to engage in abusive dismissal of Western or Western-educated scholars and intellectuals, even when they are recognized authorities in their field. This is sometimes couched as an attack on elitism, but it isn't straightforwardly that, since it turns out that some elites, for instance, tech entrepreneurs, are lauded while scholars or critical intellectuals are scorned. So we are perfectly happy to laud a Mark Zuckerberg, but are enjoined to loathe, say, a Wendy Doniger. Think about that for a moment. Who actually poses a greater threat to the rights of Indian citizens? Zuckerberg, owner of Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, with access to petabytes of private information, some 2,000 Hadoop clusters of data, in case you're interested. Zuckerberg, or a professor of Sanskrit at the University of Chicago, bringing her interpretative and expressive powers to bear on texts that most Indians, unfortunately, can't read. The attacks against Western scholars of India, like Doniger, are driven by an understandable resentment and insecurity about who are the rightful custodians of cultural knowledge. In post-colonial societies, there is a real urge to assert national identity over intellectual life, to decolonize the Indian mind. Yet such urges are often, as in our case, rooted in a foundational paradox. The fact is that the modern scholarly study and understanding of India's past originates in Western scholarship, a lineage of scholarship that still maintains a strong tradition of academic research on India. And my argument is that the point of origin certainly should inflect the understanding of the work. Absolutely, that must be considered. But it shouldn't prima facie repudiate the work, determine its cognitive value. Whether the work originates in Bangalore or Boston, in Pune or Palo Alto, we should have the intellectual confidence to assess it critically, hold it up to the light, and decide whether it's true or not. The uncomfortable fact is that it's precisely the existence of academic freedom and, of course, considerable resources in Western universities that has enabled the production of excellent scholarship about India. It's allowed international scholars to choose apparently arcane research subjects, say medieval Telugu literature or women and gender in early Buddhist monasteries, and to pursue such research freely and rigorously, exercising imaginative and interpretative powers unencumbered by instrumental compulsions. Fortunately, we here in India have in the last few decades begun to catch up, and at times not just catch up, but outmatch much of that work challenging and complicating and sometimes reversing the diminishing, patronizing stories that sometimes are told by the West about India. Scholars have brought new facts and new reality into play. However, if we want to more consistently match and surpass other countries' scholarship, we need to reverse both the current underinvestment in talent in India, but we also need to get real about the huge obstacles being thrown in our path. We will only achieve quality research if we have academic freedom to work unhindered by current ideological preferences. And that means on subjects of history, philosophy, literature, as well as law, all the disciplines, to ask awkward questions, explore unlikely avenues, pursue fruitful international collaborations with other scholars. A university should indeed be investing in study of India's extraordinarily rich humanist inheritance, in the history of Indian science, mathematics, philosophy, but not in order to vaunt their singular superiority, rather both in order to enrich the global pool of knowledge with our own and to bring Indian ideas into closer dialogue with other civilizational traditions. False frame number 5. A creative intellectual culture without the internal complexity that comes from self-criticism is impossible. All successful societies, ones that are creative, original, inventive, innovative, are rooted in a landscape containing a vast undergrowth of diverse types of intellectual life and activity. That would include scientific and rational arguments, as well as imaginative and aesthetic creations, but also polemics and protests, subversion and satire, TikToks and performance art, evolving forms that disturb habits and upend conventions. Wherever authority of every type is open to question and is called regularly to justify its own claims to authority, there one sees better, stronger arguments and ideas emerge. Universities are natural incubators and homes for this sort of intellectual contestation and evolution. But for that to happen, they need academic freedom to be able to think and express freely. On campus, students from every possible discipline or background should be able to experiment in their own fields of study, of course, but also through participating in the performing arts, writing, political debate, and even protest. That is one of the privileges of being at university, a space to imagine life which doesn't follow the trammels of the ordinary and everyday. It's a privilege, moreover, that we need to extend beyond India's social and economic elites. It's important, crucially important, to remember that the recent struggles over free expression in Indian universities, those at the forefront of these have been first-generation students coming from marginalized backgrounds, intelligent young minds who may be finding themselves in spaces freer than they've known before, and whom we've seen fighting hard, sometimes heroically, to enlarge those spaces for themselves and for others. They have challenged the certainties and privileges of both nationalist majoritarians and of social elites. And time and again, they've rightly grounded this necessary challenge in history by drawing upon radical Indian thinkers from Periyar to Ambedkar, as well as other critical traditions. These are directly political interventions with specific exigencies, yes, but I think they might also be possibly a first step towards an intellectual renaissance, a moment when new insights and experiences, hitherto shut out from the elite mainstream, collide with elite values and bring forth new types of knowledge. Imagine what we are losing by shutting that down. My 6th and final false frame is about the place of universities in democracy, that they have their instrumental uses, but that they are not intrinsically essential to democratic life. On the contrary, without universities actively contributing to self-critical culture, pursuing inquiry freely and without any nationalist or culture-induced inhibitions, improving and sustaining our democracy is impossible. Abstract ideas like democracy and freedom have to be exercised and realized in practices, not merely enshrined in texts. Institutions are the vehicles through which such ideas get realized. Institutions are the embodiment of ideas, and through their practices and actions, they have the capacity to amplify such ideas across this wider society. Take the idea of democracy, for instance. Exercised by the vote, it's embodied in institutions such as Parliament, which amplify the practice of debate and accountability across society, or maybe I should say, are supposed to amplify that practice. What about the abstract idea of freedom? Well, universities play an analogous role for the idea of freedom. In their academic research, they exercise freedom, educating scholars into its practice and what it means to be free in your thinking. And by sending them out into society, they amplify that idea. When you support freedom in universities, in other words, you create conditions so that the world well outside their campuses might be freer too. I come now to my conclusion. We're in the midst of an era of self and nation-making that has few historical precedents in terms of its scale. Competing energies and currents are playing themselves out across our land. Some seek to expand the contours of a free society, a society where individuals are at liberty to question and experiment, to challenge received knowledge and inherited practices, and to expand our definitions of what it is to be not just Indian, but human. But countercurrents and energies arise in reaction, hoping to change that course, offering the salves of collective feeling and transforming legitimate and understandable demands for recognition and respect into assertions of majoritarian power and sectarian intolerance. I'm essentially a realist. In the years ahead, these struggles will likely intensify, turn more bitter, as we descend further into an environment in which intentional misinformation, untruths, deep fakes, and other fabricated versions of reality will overrun current fact. So in the face of this tense and likely future, what do universities do? As everything changes around them, I sense rising anxiety, the thought that everything needs to change within universities too. Across the world, one sees many university leaders caught up in frenzies of, as they call it, change management, adopting and discarding model after model recommended by shifting trends in organizational or technological theory. And yet, maybe what we need most of all from our universities in this uproarious present is something else. A renewed, uncompromising willingness to anchor their institutions to the values of truth-finding, investigation of fact and data, and the logic of rational argument. At a time when the media is being rapidly eviscerated, a consequence of political intimidation and profit-driven corporatization, it is our universities, good or bad, for better or worse, who remain pretty much the only institutions in our democracy intrinsically committed, if not always consistently committed, to the pursuit of truth under conditions of freedom. So what I'd urge in closing is that universities recognize that their own future success will depend on a greater bravery than what has been required in the past, principled courage to defend and expand freedom of thought and expression, and to firmness when merited to challenge regnant popular belief. If instead universities bend and accept the 6 false frames and others that I could enumerate in my lecture, we'll all be on perilous ground. And when the core values and defining principles of the university as an institution are undermined, the university's very purpose will be corrupted. Over the last 2 days, you've had a wonderful distillation of academic expertise and experience on how best to shape the future of our universities. I have myself been a denizen of universities all my adult life. Today, though, I've chosen to speak to you as much as a citizen, as a scholar, to take and make use of what's left of our academic freedom of expression. It seems to me, sadly, that today India's universities will have to choose a side. They can become handmaidens, ancillaries, complicit to the exigencies of ideology and power, or they can pursue wholeheartedly the ambition that has driven some of the greatest universities of the modern age, to be platforms of rigorous scholarship and for fiercely free thinking and expression. It's that aspiration that makes universities the crucibles of democratic experiment, learning, and progress. Yet such principled aspiration will come with risks. It always has. But the far greater risk to the future of our institutions and our country is, always has been, silence.
Thank you, Sunil. That was an extraordinary lecture, and so much what you said resonated with all of us who heard it, and it was a very poignant call and a cautionary narrative that all of us who are living lives at universities in India and around the world need to be conscious of the extraordinary challenges universities are facing. We're very, very fortunate that you could reflect on the state of universities and also what kind of responsibilities that universities have for not only strengthening democracy, but also as an institution speaking truth to all forms of manifestations of power. So thank you once again. Now we have Professor Shiv Vishwanathan, who is a distinguished intellect and somebody who has been working on a number of issues that broadly links sociology and political science and anthropology and many other disciplines. On a lighter note, I have to say that a few weeks ago, I was having a meeting with actually a civil servant and who actually cares a lot about universities. So this person asked me, you are a private university, so do you have academic freedom? And then I said, well, we have Shiv Vishwanathan in our faculty. And then, then you must be having a lot of academic freedom. So, Shiv, I invite you to deliver your response.
I'm going to use the license that Raj has provided me today to quarrel with a historian I have a deep respect for, Sunil Khilani. I think he's a brilliant analyst, but I think today he forgot he's also the case study. And I think this is important. Because I think, Sunil, while your narrative was brilliant, your ideals of education are evocative, almost poetic. So I was almost reluctant to quarrel with you. Today I must first say that this is a piece written with the binoculars. It doesn't look at India closely. Let me just give you an example. If you look at the university only in terms of formal narratives, the Wendy Donegal incident looks one way. But if anyone knows the Indian university and the second-hand bookshop, that crisis made Wendy Donegal's book the most pirated book in India for years. Corruption. No, I think this is something you have to hand over. And I think there's something we forget. Max Weber once put it brilliantly. There's nothing like a bit of informal economy and corruption to sustain freedom. And I want to emphasize this because to a certain extent, while your ideals are true, in your unconscious, you have a Macaulayite narrative. Now, what happens with this kind of thing is you don't look at the dreams of the Indian university from the national movement. I mean, let me give you an example. When the first association for culture, Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science was built, the first goal was to rescue science from Western civilization. It's a different kind of narrative and a different kind of storytelling. And by talking about one kind of storytelling, you've forgotten the other. You talked about the dreams. The university is a dismal place. But if I had a choice of dismal places, give me the university. Because it's the university that stood up for freedom during the emergency. It's the university where over 600 people, you should remember it, Charles, in one day, over 600 people were arrested, tortured. In fact, torture became a systematic instrument only twice. once during Naxalbari, once during the emergency. And the amount of university intellectuals who faced up to torture, I think created a different narrative of freedom. And more important, it was the collaboration between the social movements and the universities that sustained the dissenting imagination. Yeah, and I think this is important to emphasize, because the amount of dissenting imaginations in India today may not be in the Scopus file or whatever that piece of garbage we call rankings is called. No, because there's another narrative, there's another world. Who talks about the great dissenting scientists in India? Who talks about the fact that actually a scientist like C.V. Seshadri could walk out of IIT, create a laboratory in a slum, and also, just take one example, the fishing struggle. People only talk about the fact it was a debate between Marxism and Christianity. It was something more. It was something sustained by dissenting scientists. You never find it in the narrative. And I think what worries me a bit is, I love the passion of your narrative, but you create an invisibility to certain forms of dissent in India, which is not fair. No, wait, let me finish. You've had your say, now I want equal time. And I want to say this importantly because it's a question of emphasis. I mean, it's a hierarchical world. If a well-behaved Suleen Khilnani says Indian university academics is dismal, you'll all clap. If a badly behaved Shiv Vishwanathan says, that's bull, you'll say, come on, what is this guy complaining about? In that hierarchy, a certain kind of narrative and a certain kind of storytelling is lost, Sunil. And I think we have to face this. Because there are a lot of creative efforts going on in the Indian university which no one is talking about. They don't enter policy documents. But after having taught in at least 15 universities abroad, give me a university cafe in India for the gossip of scholarship. There is a certain poignancy, there's a certain romanticism. But where else in this kind of scarcity will you produce such creative thinking? But the creative thinking is of a different order. You emphasize freedom. It's important. But the Indian university has its ideal diversity. We were trustees. All the logic of freedom can give you a kind of narrative of excess, which I think Chauhan has talked about brilliantly. But where will it tell you, how did Indian scholars and scientists save 150,000 varieties of rice? The West isn't interested in that kind of diversity. So I think what you've got to say is, I think your narrative was brilliant, but for once, you're a bit more one-sided than I expected. Sorry. And so what I want to say is, you hand me your binoculars, take a microscope and a kaleidoscope. Walk through the Indian university in a different way. And I'll give you an example. The very person you cited, Mukul Keshwan, I can't think of more superficial analysis of the university coming from anyone than Mukul Keshwan. Sorry, you can cite me on this. Because at the very moment he criticizes Chandrayaan, he has not a single word on the debates on the Anthropocene taking place in India simultaneously. It's the silences of Keshwan that are damning. You quoted him in innocence, but I'm not allowing Mukul that same innocence. So, no, let me finish. I'm quite sure you can come back with very powerful, eloquent arguments. But I think in a deep and fundamental way, while you created the false frames, you framed the falsity in a particular way. I think it needs a more creative ethnography. Because otherwise, I think the sources, the alternatives, the possibility of new kinds of inventiveness, which are small but there in the universities, are being lost in your narrative. So I'd love it if Suleen Khilnani, the analyst, were to also turn case study. And I mean this ruthlessly, because now let's take you as a sociological type. Let's take a person who is totally unlike you and is a bloody nuisance, Malhotra, who's now visiting professor at JNU and insists on teaching culture. The NRI as a sociological category has to be looked at when you discuss the university, because it's not just the narrative of Silicon Valley. Some of the greatest restrictions on cultural freedom in India come because of the association of NRIs. You never mentioned it. Every time I go to Stanford, you have to sit and face these, well, fellow Indians, for want of a better word. Huh? No, what I'm trying to say is, your narrative has to be complete today, Sunil, because the position you occupy in terms of studying India as a society demands a more plural narrative. So I'll just assume that the real Sunil Khilnani didn't stand up today. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Shiv. But I think it is only fair that Sunil, deserves the right to respond. So please, Sunil.
As Shiv said, I've had my say, so I won't, take. I mean, sure, if I had several hours more, I would be able, perhaps, have expanded more on the varieties and the strands of the different historical traditions. You're absolutely right, and I don't think there's anything compatible in your pointing out that, of course, there's been immense creativity, dissent, imagination, often with very frugal resources that's come out of Indian universities. Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the things I think is so heartening. But my point was that we are in a situation now where that is under threat, I think. That's under threat. So, and absolutely, I think your point about the universities during the emergency, in fact, confirms exactly what I have been trying to say in the talk, which is that universities do have a critical place to play in sustaining the life of democracy. And they have been moments when they've been very brave and dissenting. And so in that sense, as I said at the beginning of my talk, I was simply repeating and reminding that we need to remember that at moments like this. So, I mean, I think I detect in Shiv's remarks also a kind of sophisticated nativism, on that note, I think I can live with that.
So the Sonipat declaration is ready for circulation. So I already put it.
Okay, so anything I would say would be so anticlimactic, but thank you everyone, and we have now come to an end, and what a high-end note we are ending it on. So it's my honor to have been given this privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. While there's a long list of people I need to thank today, I will try to make this as brief as possible, given that we have already extended it by 15 minutes. I would first like to begin by taking this opportunity to thank our Vice Chancellor, Dr. C. Rajkumar, our Registrar, Professor Murthy, and Professor Stephen P. Marks, as their vision and guidance has enabled us to organize this conference on a theme which is extremely relevant at this time when there are constant deliberations on what the role of universities should be. I would also like to thank our guests of honor, Professor Preetam Singh, Professor Bhushan Patwardhan, Professor Dinesh Singh, and Professor Virender S. Chauhan for sharing their reflections and thoughts on this extremely relevant theme. I'm grateful to our panelists and guests who have been here with us for the last 2 days and who have contributed a great deal to this corpus of knowledge. Needless to say, this would have been nothing without our guest speakers who have traveled from across the globe to share their perspectives. In particular, we are grateful to Dr. Alice Prohaska, Dr. Paul Flather, Professor Mark Miller, Professor Austin Parrish, Professor Kenneth Holland, Professor D.K. Srivastava, and Professor Sunil Khilnani. Thanks to our wonderful faculty and esteemed deans who chaired the session, deliberated in the panels, and provided the desired direction to all the discussions. Special thanks to our teams at IHED and Orbit who have been a big part of this conference execution and participation. Our heartfelt gratitude to the members of VC Office and Registrar Office, especially Ms. Neha Gupta, Mr. Rao, Mr. Yogendra Shekhawat, who were always available with their support at all the times. Of course, most importantly, this event could not have gone off as smoothly as it did without the support of our teams, the events led by Mr. Akshit Dhamija, the designing team led by the efforts of Mr. Ankit Tyagi and Mr. Manoj Kumar, the communications team led by Ms. Anju Mohan and Mr. Devdin Conver, facility management team, audiovisual team, IT team, travel desk, transportation, housing, and documentation. A big shout out to all our volunteers for their work and support in the organization of this conference. Thank you very much, students. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank my colleague, Mr. Akhil Pruthi, for playing a crucial role in organizing and coordinating the logistics and ensuring a smoother flow of things. Thank you, Akhil. And last, but by no means the least, I would extend my heartfelt gratitude to my colleague, Mr. Abhinav Madan, who worked relentlessly to ensure that the conference goes on smoothly by working out the minutest of logistical modalities and played a huge role in making this conference a success. Thank you, Abhinav. And with this, we will close this conference, but definitely not the discussion. We truly hope to have many such introductions with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, our heartfelt thanks to Nandita for leading all of this. All right, this conference is ended. I want to briefly mention that tomorrow morning we have a founding faculty colloquium here on campus, after which in the afternoon at 4 p.m. we have the special alumni meet in Delhi. And then, of course, day after tomorrow on 30th at 4 p.m. we will be having the 10th anniversary and University Day celebrations here on campus. All of you are invited for that as well. This conference is ended, and thank you very much.